Good morning, everyone. It is 8:30 by my clock. Welcome to this morning's opening session on metal contamination. We've got two speakers this morning, Sheila Luther and Jake Gosson. That'll take us to about 9:30. Before we start, this session is sponsored by Shemco, and instead of a video this morning, I believe we have a few words from Shemco's representative, Jean Paré. Jean, are you available to speak a few words?
There you go. Hello, David.
Bonjour.
Beautiful. Bonjour tout le monde. Hi, everyone. I don't know why my webcam is not showing, but it was working a second ago. So let me just see here. I'll try to restart it. And there you go. So in all cases, not to take too much time, because yesterday we had some technical issues in the session where I was presenting. So I took, they essentially cut me up about 5 minutes of my presentation time. So I'd like first to thank ISA for organizing this event. And we've been sponsored over there for a long, long time. So it's our pleasure to be with all of you remotely for this year. And what we're hoping on this metal contamination session is, most of the sites we're dealing with around Canada are really hydrocarbon, organic type contamination material. So the metals sometimes are overlooked, but on the toxicity level, on the impact it could have on the human life and on the overall ecosystem, it's important. So it is our pleasure to typically sponsor this session on the metals. And I hope that through all the suppliers and the other presenters, you'll find some great interest and great technology presented. With that, I'll leave the floor back to David and let you guys start your session, which you're waiting. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Sean. We look forward to seeing you in person next year. This one's a bit different, eh? Okay.
Totally.
Take care. Thanks again, Jean. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sheila Luther. Sheila is with Matrix Solutions in their Edmonton office. And she's got an interesting talk on that eternal question of, is that natural or is that ours? So go ahead, Sheila, take it away.
So I want to confirm you can see my screen.
I can see your screen, yes.
Yeah, and it's looking correct. Okay. I might try putting the webcam on as well along the top, if that's working. Can you folks see me along the top as well?
Yeah, I see you, Sheila.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to thank again ISA for the opportunity to present today. I'm from Matrix Solutions, and I developed this presentation working with Stephen Creighton from the Saskatchewan Research Council. And he is listed as a co-presenter. However, he wasn't able to present today because the Saskatchewan election is upon us, and as a government employee, he's not permitted to present at this time. Just going to make sure I can switch slides here. All right, so this presentation will proceed as kind of a typical case study. So we'll go through the background, the history, regional setting, methods, results, and conclusions. But where things kind of diverted, it was a bit of a twist from a regular case study in that because of the surprising results, we did some additional interpretation of the data. And so this is what makes it interesting, I believe. And this has been an unusual site in the Alberta domain. So just tying in with the introduction there, we don't find a lot of metals issues with our well site assessment projects usually. We find them, but they're not the common, most common problem. And so this is a bit unique that way. But I think that what I wanted to mention is the process that we use. So folks said, well, if it's so unique, why is it of interest to other folks? I think where it could be applicable to other folks' work is just the process. So we used a line of evidence approach to kind of test a hypothesis. So with that process, it's very much just the scientific method, I feel, and so it could be applicable to other work. And then I think some of the methodologies that we used also might be something that folks could consider in other projects. So just some background on this site. It started as a routine well site. It had phase 1 and phase 2 program. The phase 2 was triggered because drilling waste failed the compliance option 2 checklist, which is used in Alberta. It was due to an unknown additive. And there were also bare and sparse areas on the site. The site was drilled and abandoned in 1988, so it never produced. According to file information, the sump fluids were not trenched on site, but rather were spread and worked into the surface. And over the time period, there were 3 phase 2s so far, and a total of 71 boreholes. Today's presentation will focus especially on the last phase 2, where we integrated all the historical information. So again, the initial phase 2s, they focused on the site footprint, and they were targeting potential surface spread drilling waste areas and bare areas on the site. They encountered 12 elevated trace metals and acidic pH in the soil profile. And a hypothesis was that this could be associated with drilling waste and the associated cuttings. The soil paramaterial that was encountered was a combination of till and a black clay of unknown origin. So the 2019 assessment was done to delineate the perceived impacts, the deeper soils within the former lease boundary, as well as to step out into those background areas to delineate that potential impact that was encountered. So just a bit more on the story of the site. So this just shows to the west of the center of the site, there was a very sparse vegetation area, and you can see photos of that as well. An EM survey had been done historically, but it actually showed almost like an inverse signature. So didn't really pull out any electrical connectivity issues really for the area as far as them causing the bare area. And this is just a compilation of the results up to the second phase 2, just showing that we had a lot of metals exceedances relative to the guidelines applied at that time, which were essentially tier 1 and looking at some of the background areas to the south. But the background to the south was not very high in metals. So what we found is the northern 2/3 of the well site showed metals hits, where the southern 1/3 of the site did not. So just to start to talk a little bit about the geology. So we needed to understand what the regional geology was in those initial assessments, but it wasn't really pointing to any clear direction as far as why we might have all these metals exceedances in this area. So the regional bedrock unit that's mapped for this area is the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, but we also have interbedded Bear Paw Formation. They have a subcropping edge that is northeast of where the well site is located, about 55 kilometers northeast. Now, the production well was also documented to drill through another formation called the Bad Heart. That was encountered at 800 meters below the site, and it is known to be rich in pyrite and trace metals. So there was a hypothesis that drill cuttings may have contained elevated trace metals and been spread on the site. However, we would not expect impacts from this sort of activity to extend very deep. It would typically drill cuttings and drill fluids are handled within the upper 3 meters stored in temporary sumps, and then in this case, spread on site potentially. Another hypothesis we had was that the metals might be naturally occurring in this area, but the preliminary geology information did not necessarily definitively demonstrate that. We would estimate the till to be up to 40 meters thick in this area, and based on the production well logs, the drift was documented to be at least 10 meters thick. So it wasn't like clear that we had shallow bedrock or something like that. with the assessment in 2019, we drilled 26 boreholes by solid stem auger. And the original objective was to delineate metals and pH. With that assessment, we drilled to a maximum depth of 10.5 meters below ground surface. We also did 4 hand auger holes way west of the site where we observed some bare areas, which potentially could be comparable to what we saw on site. Initially, the results were compared to Tier 1 guidelines for fine-grained agricultural land use, but based on the results we were finding, we decided additional interpretation would be needed. So this just starts to look at some of the additional work that we did to interpret the unusual results, which was essentially a lot of metals encountered both on and off lease. So the initial thing we did was look at local area background guidelines, and then we went on to do some geology, contour mapping, geostatistical profiling, electron microscopy, and some acid-base accounting, and we'll walk you through that now. So just to reiterate on the 2019 results, we did drill way off site in that assessment. This figure shows all of the holes that were drilled. Note that we did even go way east of site on the other side of the road, and the red line indicates a cross section. I'm just going to show you that next. We won't spend too much time on all the detail here, but the main message is that darker green that shows in this cross section was darker soil that we encountered in this area. And we noted that darker soil is often correlated with higher metals. This figure is showing where metals were exceeding the 95th percentile of the offsite. We found that it often exceeded, but that included some of the offsite samples. So if you look east of the road there, we also see elevated metals within that darker soil. So that's the main message with this one. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the metals that we encountered. We mentioned there's 12 metals. So if you look at the periodic table here, it covered off on a lot of different groups. So all 12 metals are highlighted here. To make it a little more simpler for today's presentation, we're going to narrow that down and speak mainly to a subset of those metals. But still covering off on some of the major groups that we encountered. Specifically, arsenic and selenium, I'd like to speak a little bit to those. What's interesting about those, if you look at arsenic and selenium on the periodic table, they're just very close proximity to both phosphorus and sulfur. And what we know is that these metals can occur where we have elevated sulfurs as well, or sulfides. Selenide may substitute for sulfur atoms in sulfides, and arsenic and sulfur may form very insoluble compounds such as arsenopyrite in these types of soils, if you know, in a case where it's naturally occurring. So those ones are particularly interesting to me. Okay, so this graph, I hope I don't overwhelm you with it, but it's an important one. Our intent with showing this is to give you some information about the distribution of these metals both on and off site. So to start with, the red curves and red histograms are on lease data. The blue are background. And so one of the messages I just wanted to make with this is that they show similar distributions and both extend into high levels. And so what we're showing with the dotted lines on each one, we have Alberta Tier 1, but we also have a site-specific guideline. The site-specific guideline was developed with based on a 95th percentile calculation, which is commonly used in Alberta. It's sort of based on the precedent set by the subsoil salinity tool, which uses that process. But a challenge with applying a 95th percentile is that we often do find that some of our results exceed that 95th percentile. So then we need to write around that in our documents. And in this case, both the background and the on lease exceeded the 95th percentile. So it wasn't sufficient to just do that evaluation. So what we did here is we also looked at doing a t-test to compare the on-site and off-site populations. The t-test can be used to compare the average concentration both in that on-site population and off-site, and determine if there's a statistical difference. So what we found with this is that none of these comparisons showed a statistically significant difference. If it was to be statistically significant, the p-value would need to be less than 0.05, and in this case, it wasn't less in any of this comparisons. And I'll mention the t-value that is displayed where it says 58, for example. That's the number of analytical samples we had -1, so the degrees of freedom. So yeah, other than that, the one other thing I wanted to just showcase with this set of graphs is if you look along the x-axis, you'll see how high the concentrations were in some cases. So we would, in some cases, be 100 or more greater than the tier 1 criteria. And so this is why we felt this site was warranting extra scrutiny. So the detailed geology review that we completed, this allowed us to look a little bit more at the parent material in this area. So as we mentioned, there's the Horseshoe Canyon Formation beneath the lease. It can be about 300 meters thick. The superficial geology is considered a meltout till associated with the Quaternary Laurentian ice sheet. And the thickness of that is less than 25 meters roughly in this area. We noted in our shallow boreholes that we drilled in the area that some sediments were consistent with glacial till. They had glacial till indicators, but potentially there could have been some Horseshoe Canyon and Bear Paw Formation material within that. And what we concluded, it was sort of a dog's breakfast, right? Not a normal, like traditional distribution of till over bedrock where you might have a discrete difference between those with depth. What we found here was sort of a dog's breakfast mix. And so likely the sediments of the Horseshoe Canyon and the Bear Paw were locally eroded and entrained with the ice sheet and then redeposited within the glacial till. And so that's our hypothesis. And then furthermore, we know the naturally occurring acid sulfate soils with elevated arsenic can occur in Alberta, and this has been well documented. However, not in this area. So it's more commonly known to occur north of Grand Prairie, sort of in the Peace River area, whereas this location is about 100 kilometers north of Edmonton. So it was a little bit unique in that respect. Okay, so into the contour mapping. We use this just to understand the distribution of the elevated metals in both background and on lease. So what the main messaging with this is that the hotspots, which are higher concentrations of these metals, extended off lease in many cases and way across the road to the east and so on. What each of these pictures shows is they're differentiating by depth. So the upper one is 0 to 1.5 meters. We have 1.5 to 3 and greater than 3 meters depth. And so with the different metals, they all showed this same trend that there was some exceedances for high concentrations of metals extending off-site. And particularly you can see in the shallow soils, it extending into those bare areas to the west of site. And then east of site and north of site are commonly elevated in metals. And so all the metals showed kind of a similar distribution with some minor differences. So now we're going to speak a bit to some geostatistical correlations that we also did to understand these metals. And what we find helpful with this is that sort of the distribution of these correlations can be similar between background and on-lease samples. In this display, we have background along the top and then the on-lease samples at the bottom, and we have by different depths, 0 to 1.5, 1.5 to 3, and greater than 3 meters. The way these work is positive correlations are in blue, negative are in red, and the color intensity and size of the circle is proportional to the correlation. So what we found is some of our focus metals were often correlated with each other. Things like arsenics and selenium were highly correlated with sulfate, as per some of the information I presented earlier. There were similar trends in the distributions of these correlation matrices between on-lease and background, particularly if you look at the first two sets of figures. And Hydrogen was often correlated with metals at shallower depths, and that was both on lease and background. And barium was not correlated with sulfate. And so we know that barium sulfate can form an insoluble precipitate, so that might explain why they weren't correlated. We did some vertical profiling. So this is just selected boreholes, both on lease and background. On lease is along the top and background is the next. So the main messaging we found with this was the depth of the higher concentrations was often in the 2 to 6 meter depth, as I showed in that cross section earlier. Borehole 24 and 25 were a little bit exceptions in the on-lease areas. They were in proximity to a barrier on site, and they showed some higher metals near the surface. We don't have a vertical profile for the background bare areas, however, and those also showed us similar trends with higher concentrations of metals right at the surface. I'm going to speak a bit to this ChemScam methodology next. These slides were prepared by Stephen Creighton. I really enjoyed the opportunity to have this kind of analytical information available, and this was able to really tease out the true processes happening at the site. This allows us to identify mineral grains and really quantify the mineralogy of the material. And then from there, we were also able to get trace metal analysis and some indication of the potential acidification characteristics of this material. So for this display, this is an example of some of the information that is available through ChemScan analysis. We were able to get mineralogical information. So this on the left side, we have the percentage of a particular mineral. We have the light green is all clay material, and then the other portions are shown along the top. The bright yellow is our pyrite. And so what we have here is on-site, east of site, north of site, and west of site. We found on-site, east of site, and north of site all had significant pyrite present. So pyrite in the percentage levels, and we were able to demonstrate that through this analysis, which is great and helps us kind of further substantiate that the material on site and north of site, for example, that show a similar profile are likely of similar genetic origin, debunking then the hypothesis that surface spread material might have introduced this. So then this next figure shows something about the sulfur mineralogy itself. So just the minerals present in the material that contains sulfur. And this focuses on pyrite, which is yellow, gypsum, blue, and barite in gray. So you'll see on-site, east of site, and north of site had significant pyrite, somewhere in the 0.9 to 3% levels, and quite a bit of gypsum as well, and then some barite. The west of site had much lower percentages and was a little bit more transitional, we believe, into the till material. The sulfur deportment figures to the right indicate the mass of sulfur in the different components. And so we had quite a bit of the sulfur and the total soils. The amount of sulfur partitioned into pyrite was up to 60% of the material, but very similar again, both on site and north of site. So the other thing that was interesting is we can actually get pictures of the pyrite. So we know we can definitively conclude there's pyrite in this material. And it's what's also interesting to know about pyrite is that it's more likely to be acid generating when it's a finer grain size. And so some pyrite can be locked in non-reactive minerals, and then it poses less of a risk. So with this figure here, we're just showing that the smaller grain sizes have greater potential for liberation of pyrite. So liberation of acidifying components, basically sulfuric acid. And so the yellow grains, the very fine grains in the top left of these figures are the ones that are most likely to be reactive. So a significant portion of the pyrite in this material was quite readily reactive. The figure on the left side is compiling both on-site and north of site, which showed similar distributions, and then east of site also fairly similar. So the last sort of results and interpretation slide here, we're looking at just some traditional static acid-base accounting analysis that was done by SGS laboratories out in Burnaby. So this analysis is quite readily available to the industry and is another piece of information to demonstrate that yes, both on and off site were acid generating materials. Borehole 25 shown here, it was on site, 31 was to the east of site, and 40 to the north of site. So they showed similar acid generating potential. Anything below those blue curves through the middle of the site, middle of this figure, are more likely to be acid generating. They're net acid generators.
Sheila, we're down to 5 minutes.
Super. Okay, I'm just coming to my conclusion slide. So essentially, the information that we presented provided a line of evidence to substantiate that what we encountered at this site was naturally occurring metals, although it wasn't initially evident through the regional geology and soils information. Through the information that we've presented, we are able to substantiate that the elevated metals, both on and off site, are attributable to naturally occurring shallow pyritic shale that we believe was entrained by the glacier and deposited, and that's how we got sort of that mixed material of till and pyritic shale. The outcomes of this is that the anticipated effort to achieve site closure is substantially reduced due to the level of information that we were able to obtain. And we are recommending that remediation and reclamation focus on the objective to achieve equivalent land capability rather than focusing on reaching a specific generic guideline, such as a Tier 1 guideline in this case. And I just want to acknowledge a lot of the contributors to this presentation. I won't read them through, but we'll leave this slide up, and I want to ensure that all these folks are recognized. There's a lot of folks that were involved, and particularly thank the Orphan Well Association for funding this work.
Thank you, Sheila. Very, very interesting. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. If anybody wants to ask a question, there's a function on the menu where you can type one in. Looks like we have one question here. Sheila, how do you determine the number of boreholes you drill on a site? Is it random sample or more to delineate the contamination zone?
Yeah, so normally we do target the areas of potential environmental concern when we're conducting assessments of well sites in Alberta. It's an iterative process. We conduct the phase 1 to determine what those areas of potential environmental concern are, and then we target our phase 2s. And the way it's typically being done these days in Alberta, I believe, is kind of a lot of the clients I work for, at least, we do it in an iterative process. We start with just a preliminary phase 2, sorry, that's just targeting potential areas of concern. If we don't find actual exceedances, we're able to send that site to reclamation. However, if we encounter exceedances, then we proceed to do delineations. In this case, it ended up to be quite extensive because of this metals issues. And some people would say, well, why bother? I mean, it's natural, but that wasn't evident initially, right? There was a hypothesis that that could be from drilling waste. And if it had been surface spread, well, unfortunately, it would have covered much of the lease.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we got Neil asking, Sheila, did you sample metals in groundwater at this site or just in the soil?
We did not sample metals in groundwater because it was demonstrated to be naturally occurring through our soil assessment, and so we didn't feel it triggered a groundwater assessment at this time. Keeping in mind, this site is a drilled and abandoned well site, and so the only potential sources of contamination from the well site activities would be drilling waste and anything that was handled at the time of drilling, but there was no production history.
Okay, well, thank you. That takes us to just about 8:30, correction, 8:59. So I think we'll end it here. Again, I'd like to thank Sheila for this interesting talk. And Logan, if we can switch over to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jake Gosson. Jake is Jake is from Hemera, and he will be speaking about an interesting application of iron species in groundwater to control a copper plume that was potentially reaching a river. So we'll get Sheila to switch off and we'll switch over to Jake here. And Jake, when you're ready, you can take it away.
Excellent, thank you. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see and hear you.
Excellent. Well, we'll take it away then.
All right.
Thanks everybody. Thanks everyone very much for coming to my talk to Virtual RemTech, or as I'm calling it, Formal from the Waist Up RemTech. So today we're going to go over a case study of a pilot scale in situ remediation of dissolved metals that we've been working on. This is what we're going to be talking about. I'll briefly give you the site history and the investigations that have been completed to date, the results of which fed into our conceptual site model and our remedial design. I will briefly touch on the bench scale testing because a couple of years ago at RemTech, I had an entire presentation on that, but just the high level points. Then we'll get right into the pilot scale injections, which is really the bulk of the presentation here. I'll present some results, interpretation, and lessons learned, and then briefly touch on next steps because we are moving into full scale, and hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. Well, and that's me on the right-hand side there, and I can assure you that was the cleanest I was the entire program. That's day one. So it's a former industrial site. One of their processes used copper as a catalyst in the very elegant manner of the 1950s and 60s. When the catalyst was spent, they dumped it in the ground. The site was decommissioned in the late 1980s, and it's been undergoing investigation and remediation since the early 1990s. Hemera got involved with the program in 2015 and noted that there was a copper plume that was approximately 700 meters long, yet it was only defined by 4 wells. So in 2015, we did a supplemental site investigation, drilled a bunch more wells, and high-level points are we identified a new hotspot that was 3 times higher concentration that had previously been identified at the site. We did some soil mineralogy analysis, and we did this using a modified Tessier, which is a sequential extraction. When we get to the conceptual site model section, I'll explain why. A lot of the minerals that we are interested in are amorphous, and so a lot of traditional mineralogy methods like XRD just aren't appropriate to characterize the soil mineralogy. And what we found is that there was approximately 500 milligrams of iron oxides per kilogram of soil and about 30% limestone. Part of the program involved doing some pore water sampling, and we found that the copper was reaching the river at about 7 times its guideline value. So we did some toxicity testing and found out that we were currently at the effects threshold. So then the question is are things going to get better or are things going to get worse? So to answer that question, we did some geochemical modeling using Freak-C and predicted that concentrations reaching the river are expected to increase by about 10 times. So remediation is definitely required. So then the million-dollar question is, how does one remediate dissolved metals? Well, you start by developing your conceptual site model. So hydrogeologically, we're dealing with a glacial outwash. It's gravel and cobble. It's screaming high hydraulic conductivity, greater than 10 to the minus 3 meters per second. The aquifer is underlain by a very low K bedrock unit. The entire thickness of the gravel and cobble outwash unit is impacted, but the impacts do not extend into the bedrock. So the dominant species of copper at the site is cupric, or copper 2+. We know, looking at the literature, that copper, amongst other metals, likes to adsorb and or co-precipitate on the surface of hydrospheric oxide minerals. You might also know them as iron oxyhydroxides. And for the duration of the program, we'll just refer to them as HFO because those words are way too polysyllabic. Also, based on the work of Zombach, metals compete for adsorption sites. And you can see there from the figure on the right that based on Zombach's work, copper competes most strongly with other metals competing, but just electronegatively not as strongly. So conceptually, this is what we think is going on. We've got a copper source below the water table. It's resolved itself into a copper plume. There is some natural HFO present in the aquifer material. Some of the copper is adsorbed, some of the copper is dissolved, and is currently reaching the river. What we're looking at here are spatial profiles up the center line of the plume based on the Freak-C modeling we did. Now, the blue line was the distribution of copper in the aquifer in 2015. And you can see that when we're dealing with metals, because they're not reactive, a kilogram of copper is a kilogram of copper for the rest of time, is that as clean upgradient groundwater flushes through the system, some of the copper desorbs and gets flushed down the aquifer. And you can see that the mass is going to redistribute over time, and it's going to peak at about, like I said, about 10 times higher than it's currently reaching the aquifer in the next hundreds of years. So another thing we can do with Freak-C is we can conduct a bunch of remedial simulations. So what you're looking at here is each horizontal line is the center line of the plume. And Freak-C, you define your mineral composition and your solution composition in each cell. The cells that are highlighted in orange, I increased the HFO concentration by 10 times above background level. And it's quite difficult to see in the right-hand margin here, but you can see groundwater flowing from left to right, that if we only look at the source area, there's still enough mass down gradient that the concentration reaching the receptor doesn't decrease very much. Whereas if essentially we put a barrier adjacent to the river, the concentration decreases by orders of magnitude to values less than the guideline value. So conceptually, this is our remedial conceptual model. Again, the cell on the left is from the previous one. We have some natural HFO present that's absorbing some of the copper, with a lot being in the solution phase. We want to increase the HFO concentration in the aquifer so that more copper adsorbs and maybe even co-precipitates, such that we can stop the plume in its tracks and prevent it from reaching the river. Well, that all sounds well and good, but I mean, let's prove it. I mean, this is just theory. That's just a geochemical model. So we did some bench scale testing in the lab using columns. And I'll just show you here that the setup is contaminated groundwater is flowing from bottom to top. We had 5 ports on the side of the column and 1 port on the outlet. So we could measure to what extent copper decreased along the flow path at various points, as well as through the column. So the way we set it up is that 5,000 milligrams of iron per kilogram of rock was what we simulated using Freak-C. So to test its efficacy, we decreased it by 25% in the second column, increased it by 25% in the third column, and then we had an unamended column where we just filled it with soil from the site and ran contaminated groundwater through it. And based on our modified Tessier, background is about 500 milligrams of iron per kilogram of rock. So it's a pretty simple recipe. You take contaminated soil and groundwater from the site, you mix ferrous sulfate heptahydrate, which is that blue-looking crystal. You oxidize it. In this instance, we used calcium peroxide, and in the end, you get rusty soil, and the rusty soil is what we're after. So again, I had an entire presentation on this a couple of years ago, but I just want to share results from one of the columns. The third column with 75%, so 3750 milligrams of iron per kilogram. And the top line here is your influent concentration. It was about 0.35 milligrams per liter. Down here is the copper concentration at the first port, so only 10 centimeters up. And you can see that copper rapidly decreased to about 0.001 milligrams per liter, or 1 microgram per liter, and stayed there for the duration of the test. So the copper did not even reach the first port. Well, that's promising. So our geochemical model did in some way mimic reality. But now we've got to scale it up. Now we've got to scale it up to full scale at the site here. So this is kind of our setup here. The way we did it is we installed a 4-inch extraction well so we could extract groundwater to mix with our reagents. And then we installed 3 transects of wells, a 4-inch injection well, 2 a nested 1-inch pair, 1 well screened at the top of the aquifer, 1 well screened at the bottom of the aquifer, just so we could see if we were getting good vertical distribution in the aquifer. and then a 2-inch monitoring well down gradient. The sequence of injections was a cube of groundwater mixed with calcium peroxide, a half cube of unamended groundwater just to push it away from the well screen, and then a cube of ferrous sulfate mixed with groundwater, and then again another half cube of groundwater, again just to push it away from the well screen to avoid fouling. Daily, we were taking samples from the 1-inch pair and using a hack spectrophotometer and measuring for ferrous iron just to see to what extent we were oxidizing and precipitating the iron. And this is shown better in a schematic cross-section here. So you can see we're injecting in sequence calcium peroxide and ferrous sulfate heptahydrate. It's precipitating out as ferrihydrite, which is a common HFO mineral. We've got our 2-inch monitoring wells, our 2 1-inch monitoring wells down gradient where we're measuring for iron 2+ to see to what extent it is precipitating. We set our threshold at 3 milligrams per liter. The reason for this is that is the upper detection limit of the hack kit, and also stoichiometrically, 1 milligram per liter of dissolved oxygen will precipitate 8 milligrams per liter of ferrous iron, and our background dissolved oxygen in the aquifer is about 0.5. So there's enough natural oxygen in the aquifer to precipitate about 4 milligrams per liter. That worked pretty well with the hack kit. And if anything broke through, we had an air compressor on site. We stuck a stinger down the 2-inch well, and we bubbled oxygen to precipitate any residual iron that wasn't oxidized by the calcium peroxide. Okay. Now the moment you've all been waiting for. Let's look at some results here. So one of the things I'm going to show you, which I think is really cool about this, is we did all our data collection digitally, and then we had our GIS guy put together a dashboard. So I'm just going to show you an example of it right now. Hopefully you can see my screen here. And what was really neat about this was the data was collected in real time on a tablet. And so long as the tablet was in cell range, it was updating the dashboard in real time. So even if you weren't on site, you could track field parameters, iron readings using the hack kit, all this data. And then it was also synced with our SQL server for SDAT. So as analytical results came in from the lab, because we were also collecting samples to verify our field measurements, it was all updating the dashboard in real time. And so you can see here that at injection well 1, the copper concentration dropped from about 250 micrograms per liter down to less than the laboratory detection limit, which is also less than a tier 1 guideline, and it stayed there. It didn't rebound. We resampled this last summer, and concentrations are staying down, which is really good news because it shows that it's working. Switching back here, and then you can see that we calculated the percent removal of copper, and you can see that in the immediate vicinity of the injection well area, in places we got greater than 99% removal. Now you can see there's this little pocket here, so maybe there was some channeling and we weren't getting really good distribution of the iron. But then a couple hundred meters down gradient, we're still seeing these large decreases in dissolved copper concentration. And again, to reiterate, we resampled again this past summer, a year later, and concentrations are staying down. So this is great. We're sequestering copper and it's staying sequestered. So as part of our confirmation of remediation, we drilled some more boreholes, collected some more soil, and then ran this modified Tessier again. The different sequential extractions are shown on the right-hand panel there. The first one is exchangeable. So if copper is adsorbed on the surface of copper, can we knock it off? Fraction 2 is what's bound to carbonates. Fraction 3 is really what we're interested in. That's the HFO. And then fraction 4, which I'll touch on in a minute, is meant to target what's bound to organics, but it's also run at a pH of 2. So high-level results are we didn't reach our target HFO concentration. We weren't precipitating as close to the well screen as we thought we were, so that mass was somewhat distributed. So the highest concentration we reached was only a little over 3,000. However, having not reached our target HFO value, we still reached our target dissolved copper value, which was great. The results from fraction 1 indicated that the copper is going to stay adsorbed. You'll recall from that earlier figure, copper adsorbs amongst the most strongly onto HFO. And despite using Falcon tubes and centrifuges, we weren't able to desorb the copper, which is great, which suggests we're actually co-precipitating the copper. Another little test we did is we found a lot of iron in fraction 4, which didn't really make any sense because we've measured organic matter in this aquifer and it's essentially devoid of organic matter. So we put our thinking caps on and noted that, well, it's run at a pH of 2. So are we in fact precipitating even more stable iron oxides, which is great news. Because rather than precipitating only HFO, we're precipitating some more stable oxides, which is great because they're even more stable sinks for copper. So geochemically, what we conclude is a lot of literature shows that initially when you precipitate HFO, it's colloidal. And we saw that in our down gradient monitoring wells where total copper was high, but, total iron was high, but dissolved iron was less than detect. So we had colloids, but over time, the colloids are going to cluster and become more crystalline. So rather than having ferrohydrite, over time, it's going to shift more towards like goethite. It also looks, based on fraction 1, that rather than absorbing, we're actually co-precipitating, which is great because then the iron or the copper is even more strongly bound to the surface of the HFO. The concentrations are stable. We went back a year later. We're going to continue to go back for the next few years to confirm that the copper isn't desorbing. And so far, it's stable. The HFO is insoluble at our prevailing pH and ORP. We know HFO reductively dissolves. Up gradient of our site, there are no gas stations. There are no dry cleaners. There's no source of acidity and or reducing conditions. So we can anticipate, and we'll verify this, that the solution is sustainable. We've created stable HFO that's going to continue to remove copper from solution and won't remobilize in the future. So we did learn some lessons. The aquifer is so highly hydraulically conductive that even though we were precipitating out iron within a short distance of the injection point, it did transport down gradients as mobile colloids, just owing to the shear in training these colloids with groundwater flow, especially under injection pressures. Another lesson learned is we can go with the lower concentration and still meet our target dissolved copper concentrations. That's great. That's less chemical mass. That's less oxidant mass. That's less time injecting because we need to get less mass into the ground, which is fantastic news. The other lesson we learned is that we really want to go with a more aggressive oxidant. Calcium peroxide is great because it's food safe, and if you start looking for it, you're not going to end up on a no-fly list. But we really want a more aggressive oxidant because then the oxidant volume can decrease and again, saves time. We can go with higher dosing. When we go to full scale, we can get it completed in a shorter duration. So next steps. I'm pleased to announce that we are going full scale. Now, we've modified our injection setup here. And I'll just kind of walk you through the figure on the right there. So previously we were injecting up gradient and allowing the HFO to precipitate in the direction of groundwater flow. And we noted that because of the mobile colloids, we were really distributing the iron mass over a larger volume. And we really want to concentrate it. We really want that concentration of force, those high HFO concentrations. So what we've done now is we're actually injecting down gradient and extracting up gradient. And what we're hoping to do there is create a stagnation zone so that the HFO is really precipitating over that small volume between the injection well, the extraction well, and now we have 2 down gradient wells. What was really neat about those is, again, we used aquatrolls, and you could put one of those troll columns on top and then get real-time in situ field parameter measurements, so you can monitor for things like acidity. The precipitation of HFO is a corrosion reaction, so is the calcite doing its job and buffering that acidity? DO as a measure of when our oxidant is breaking through, just so we can kind of track our injection progress. Down gradient, we continue to measure our ferrous iron to make sure that we're precipitating it out. And we've switched to hydrogen peroxide. We're also monitoring that down gradient. And then at the extraction well, we are monitoring for hydrogen peroxide for recirculation because we don't want that hydrogen peroxide reacting within our injection lines because it's a gas expansion and it's a hazard. So this is kind of the setup we're going for. The injections are ongoing. We'll be moving to performance verification in the next couple of months here, where we'll be again doing our modified Tessier analysis to evaluate to what extent we've increased our HFO concentration and over what spatial extent of the aquifer. We need to let the mobile colloids settle out of solution so that the copper can co-precipitate, so we can collect our groundwater samples to measure to what extent we're removing copper from solution. And then ultimately, we're going to go back to the river and do our pore water sampling to verify that the concentrations reaching the river are in fact decreasing. This is a long plume. It's 700 meters long. And even though it's high K, it's going to take time for parcels of groundwater to flush through the system and for us to see a measurable decrease in the dissolved copper concentration reaching the pore water. So maybe I'll have something to show you folks next year, and hopefully it'll be in person. And I'd be happy to answer any questions any of you folks have. We covered a lot of ground there, and I think I spoke quickly. When I dry run it, it took me 25 minutes, and I'm so excited I've done it in 20 now.
Well, that was certainly a passionate and energetic talk, Jake. Thanks for that. Very interesting. We've got a couple of questions here for you. Leslie Gray's asked, why did you set up the columns vertically and run the flow from bottom to top?
When we were doing our literature review, that just seemed to be the methodology that was used. We didn't want any gravity flow, so by going bottom to top, we could more mimic the residence time that we were expecting to see in the actual aquifer. Whereas if you go top to bottom, it's just kind of falling through. You could risk unsaturating the column, and you have less control over the flow and ultimately the residence time, which is what we wanted to simulate to see if there was a kinetic control on the extent to which copper would stick to the HFO.
Okay, thanks. Sheila's got a question. How long will the remediation program be required? So how long are you anticipating this is going to take?
So based on the column testing and everything we've done to date, we think that it's going to be one application to hit our target HFO concentrations in 3 different parts of the plume. And then what we're going to be looking at is what the travel time is for a parcel of groundwater between unamended areas and amended areas. And that's going to inform our the frequency of sampling to show that the concentrations are in fact decreasing. So I'm going to have to do some more frequency modeling. And a lot of it is just going to be based on, Darcy's law, because copper is flowing largely as a conservative solute when it's in solution. And that'll inform what our post-remediation verification program will look like.
Super, thank you. Another question. There's a 700 meter long plume length. What was the width and how do you handle that width scenario?
Excellent question. So the width is about 100 meters. And so for the 3 areas that we're going to be amending the aquifer and increasing the HFO, we've installed a network of wells across the entire width of the plume, if you will. We did some long-term water level monitoring to make sure that we understood the flow direction, because it does deviate somewhat along the length of the plume. And so, yeah, we just have to amend through the entire width just to make sure that we get it all, because as my contaminant hydrogeology professor told me in university, you might get 99% of the plume and that still might not be enough.
Right on. That the response was perfect. Thank you. So you obviously answered the question. Now I've got a question. You mentioned that colloidal transport looks like it's a thing here, given that coarse alluvial gravel that you're dealing with. For your validation sampling, your comparison to guideline to indicate whether you've achieved your goals or not, what type of sample are you collecting? Are you collecting a dissolved sample, or are you collecting a total sample, or are you collecting both? And how are you comparing them?
Yeah, so we're collecting both. When we're in the field monitoring iron down gradients to confirm that we are indeed precipitating out the iron, we ran both dissolved and total. We ran them using the spectrophotometer field test strips, and we also sent samples to the lab to confirm. What we're seeing is that when we filter the sample, iron is non-detect, but when we're not filtering the sample, iron is screaming high, and like the water looks orange, like it's clearly rusty. So before we collect our remedial verification groundwater samples, we're going to confirm that our total iron and our dissolved iron are less than about 1 milligram per liter. Then we'll know that those colloids are settling onto the surface of various clasts in the aquifer. And then when we do our verification boreholes, we're going to drill in several spots to see how the distribution of HFO actually precipitated in the aquifer. We're sure hoping it's between the injection and extraction well, but based on what we've seen down gradient, we know some of the colloids are moving down. So rather than doing 1 or 2 boreholes in each transect, we're going to do probably 4 or 6, so we can get a good handle on the distribution.
Super, thank you. I don't see any more questions on the question app here, and I don't have any more. So I guess you wrap that up well within your time, Jake. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing the results of your full-scale trial or your full-scale application, actually, maybe even next year. So
me too.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank both Sheila and Jake for those interesting talks. And again, thanks to Shemco and Jean Paré for sponsoring this particular session. That wraps the metals session a little bit early. So we'll turn it back over to Jake, our technician, to shut us all down. And we look forward to seeing everybody next year, hopefully in real life. So take care, everyone. Thanks again, Jake.
Take care, folks.